Hey guys, this is Miko. I'm back with another video. This one's going to be a guide to clump fighting. If you want to participate in polls I put out every day, make sure to vote on what you want to see. I pick from here, and this is how I choose what I'm going to talk about every day. So the content is strictly dictated by you guys, and if you have other suggestions, leave them as comments, and I'll read those and reply to those every day. The other shout out slash thing to look at is I have a community Discord now, which has a decent amount of members at this point. But this is where I would put VODs in and we talk about meta stuff and whatnot. So decent thing to join if you want to be a little bit more active. But for the video topic today, we're talking about clump fights. Clump fights, there are a few different ways that they're done. I'd say in NA in particular, they at least at the lower to mid tier companies, they tend to be more point centric, or as in like they're focused around a particular point, not necessarily the point itself, but people tend to ball up on a particular spot and all in on that particular spot until they either win or lose. And in EU, it's basically the opposite, where everyone's really spread out. So when if I'm looking at like an NA clump, you kind of have like radial circles that kind of go out depending on what class you're playing. So you have your bruisers, which I'm gonna label with a G so that it doesn't get confused with the blunderbuss, and those are usually in the center because they're on great axe usually. And then after that, you usually have your void gauntlets that are kind of spread out more in this like mid layer, and then beyond that you have your blunderbuss, and then beyond that you have your bows, and which I would label with an X for a dex. And these people don't really play super static; they're kind of more dynamic in general. And then those are also interlaced with healers that are kind of throughout the point. And it's not like perfectly centric like this. There's usually like kind of a line. Like reds will play mostly on one side and blues will play mostly on the other, but there's exceptions to that. Uh, the kind of main consequence of this strategy is a lot of the damage just tends to nuke people in the center, and people in the center tend to not do as well. So you see this a lot in NA where people are focused like completely on basically nuking this one center point area, which results in a lot of like support people that should not be able to be playing for free tend to play for free around these like outside areas. Like if you're a bruiser, the biggest thing is like the bruisers are the ones usually dictating this sort of situation because the bruisers go on a person, VGs support the bruisers, blunderbuss kind of support the VGs and the bruisers. So basically, depending on where the bruisers are playing or the Great X Warhammers, which are labeled with a G, is like where this kind of radial thing will happen. Bruisers a lot of the time tend to go for other bruisers. I think one that's a generally a mistake, and instead, if you have great axe people or bruisers go on blunderbuss or void gauntlets or healers, that tends to be more favored for that team that tends to do that. The reason why is then the people that are normally nuking you and are just it's the reason why you get one shot randomly. Those people are the people that you're on, and they're a lot squishier, and they will have to try to kite. And then the great axe will try to peel for them, but great axe tends to be a little bit worse at peeling than the other support roles that are in the form of blunderbuss and void gauntlet, and like bows, and which I labeled with an X for decks. So I would say like this style is generally a little bit phased out at this point. If you look at the top tier of NA, this style doesn't really exist as much. Like if you see a really big clump, and the IGVG is going to look to try to blow that up, so it doesn't make sense to try to clump that much, and everyone tries to spread out a lot more, so that this doesn't really exist. So when you have multiple of these kind of circles going along, what this ends up doing is it kind of ends up turning it into like a sort of tug of war match where you have like a red side and you have a blue side. Of course, this isn't as simple as being flat. Like on a point, this is kind of radial, so you'll have like a more of a semicircle. But to simplify it, I'm just gonna do it as kind of a line. In the middle of this line, do you have your great axe, which again I'm trying to label with a G. As much as that looks like a six there, that's supposed to be a G, and they're kind of fighting in this middle area for space. It's usually more chaotic at those lines, and then beyond that, again, you have your IGVGs, and then beyond that, I'll just do it quickly. Like you have your IG, and then you have your blunderbuss, and then you have your decks kind of in a different spot. This is sort of like the second level of clump fighting, where people tend to be more spread out in terms of distance, but they still kind of play the same way, where they're all kind of behind each other. If you want to get really advanced with the clump fighting, there still almost always tends to be lines in wars, where I'll start drawing that radially more. So like you'll have like your me trying to draw a semicircle with a mouse is just chaotic, but this looks better than other stuff that I would normally do. So there's usually like a red and a blue side, and there's usually more blue people on this blue side, and then there's more red people on this red side. So I'll just kind of like not really go over the super detailed thing as before. Like you just say that this is like a generic amount of people. Like you'd say like maybe s- I'd say like 75 to 80% of an army will be on one of these sides, and then the other 25 to 20% that will be kind of out around either around the point, like kind of in this whole space, like they're just kind of rotating around, or they are actually on the other side and they're kind of just softly in these spaces in order to get more value, and then they'll dip back onto their side. And this is where you actually get to weird mechanics that will actually turn fights very easily. So as an IG like VG player, a lot of the time as an IG VG player, and even as a blunderbuss, you get the most value when you're actually inside of the enemy's line. And if the enemy tries to hit you, if you're a heavy player, that's generally a mistake. So basically, if you're a relatively tanky class, it makes sense to play on the other team's line generally. So if you're a heavy bruiser, as EU likes to run a lot, I think it makes sense to play on the other team's line and swing on either supports or healers. Generally, in the EU they play for zones, so you're swinging on people in your zones, but you're prowling the blunderbuss first, I would say. Then you're prowling the void gauntlets, and then you're prowling the healers. Reason why I say blunderbuss first is if you prowl a void gauntlet, uh, Void Gauntlet, so it's not like a thing that you just start swinging on and you tend to get a lot of value because it'll lock you in place. But if you turn and use your Warhammer abilities when you're in range in a Void Gauntlet, kind of chaotically, like if you go for like a Warhammer like fake like you go for just a stun play and you're playing in this like red zone, then you're gonna stun everyone in this radius, right? Which tends to be a lot more than if you were going for a stun play in your own zone, which is like why a lot of the abilities make more sense to use in other teams' kind of controlled space, if you will. There are some wars where this space doesn't really exist, but as a fundamental level, whenever stuff kind of gets chaotic, it still goes back to that base example where you have a bruisers that are fighting, like as or maybe they're not fighting a bruiser itself. Like say that you're on the blue team and you have a bruiser who is on top of a blunderbuss right now, and there's a void gauntlet that is pretty close. If you're the IGVG here, or the Void Gauntlet user as the blue, you want to be in either position like this so that you can hit a scream in this sort of like radial area, if that makes sense, and you could try to hit both people. Or you could try to be in a position back like here, so you hit a scream in an orb down this lane, which will make it so that this bruiser is able to collapse in and get those kills. The part that gets weird is who goes first, the Void Gauntlet or the Blunderbuss. The Void Gauntlet is trying to lock the most people in a dense area uh, to get the value of the bruiser. But the thing is a lot of bruisers tend to not follow up on void gauntlets. So even if there is, say, four red people, like you have two bruisers, you have a void gauntlet, and or you have two blunderbuss, a void gauntlet, and a bruiser. Like if they're all like this, and I'm the void gauntlet, and I scream this, but my Great Ox player, say, is not actually here, and he is like way over here, this is not going to do anything effectively because these guys are just going to walk away from this and they're not going to pop coins. They're not going to do anything at a high level war. So a lot of the times as a Void Gauntlet, you either tend to play off what I call the shoulder of your bruiser. So you're playing really close to them. Bruiser goes for a grab, you immediately scream it, and then you kind of go for that combo. I think that's the very, very simple way to play. The more complicated way to play is the Void Gauntlet is the target for the bruiser, but you don't see this as often in NA. In EU, it's a little bit more common because the IGVGs are more tanky. In NA, it's more of a maybe a Void Gauntlet is taking an angle and looking for a scream in this direction, which still works. But in EU, typically people are not balled up like this. Like typically, if you're going to go for value, people tend to do this like line thing that I talked about earlier, where you have a Great Axe and you have your Void Gauntlet, then you have your Blunderbuss, and you have your decks and your healers. As a blue void gauntlet in this position, your best value is to really to play behind everyone and go for this scream. Typically, the decks and the healer are not this close, and the decks and the healer are more so like here. Like they're way out there and you can't really get them. So you're just trying to kind of play behind that enemy line at times and then look for those key screams while your great axe are going in. So that's where it gets really important for great axe players to use their comms. Or as a VG, you're mainly looking to track your great axe's gravel because most bruisers hard commit off gravels. At the highest level of play, people tend not to hard commit off gravels and do the classic like grav into shockwave into maelstrom. The reason why they don't do that is because that animation is extremely predictable, and if you go for it every single time, then people will just naturally dodge it. So you see bruisers at a higher level maybe just go for a shockwave out of the blue, or they just go for a wrecking ball like semi-randomly, or maybe they'll just go like wrecking ball into maelstrom and then use their grab after into or sorry, they'll go shockwave into maelstrom and then they'll use their grab after with a wrecking ball, or they'll do like some variation to make their combo last a little bit longer and be able to be in the clump a little bit more. And when you're able to kind of hit those combos on groups of people as a great accent avoid gun at the same time, that's when stuff tends to get a lot of value. Where Blunderbuss comes in this picture is Blunderbuss is the main damage on top of this that allows the great accent avoid gauntlet to actually secure the kill. The void gauntlet is basically the CC person that locks people in place. The who is trying to boost the damage of the great axe in the blunderbuss. So if a void gauntlet is here and drops an oblivion here, but it doesn't hit the great axe of the blunderbuss, the void gauntlet isn't as getting as much value as you want. So this would be a situation where if you have a blunderbuss here and a great axe here as a void gauntlet, I'd want to be in this position so that my oblivion will get value for both of these guys, and they'll be able to hit this clump. So usually what that entails is from a void gauntlet perspective, in order to be safe, you want to kind of play on the near where your bruisers are, but you don't want to play directly on them. You want to play a little bit of an angle, and then you want to do a thing what people call wrapping. So you try to push this like outside angle, so you get a better uh, value with your scream and you're able to hit more people. Because if you were to scream just this like frontline area, the bruiser would tend to push you back because the bruiser sees someone that should not be close to them because they have a melee weapon and you have a ranged weapon. So you won't be able to get this close that freely, but if you go in from an angle that is near their Void Gauntlet, the Void Gauntlets typically won't solo scream a Void Gauntlet unless they're like really, really deep in their back line and Dex is looking to blow them up. So you could take a little bit of an angle and then you can look for a scream, and then your Great Axe can either follow on that scream, or usually what I try to do is I'll play near my Great Axe, and my Great Axe go for that, and that's when I'll start rapping, and that's when I'll go for that scream. So you have to be like kind of quick with that, but that's like a really easy way to get value. There's other ways to do this too, from a Void Gauntlet perspective. If you see that your Great Axe is going for a play like this, and you're behind them, which is something I try to do a lot on retakes and talk about in VODs and retakes, you can look to shower so that these red guys can't easily back up because usually when people get collapsed on, their natural instinct is to run directly away. So you can put a shower there and they'll walk in the shower, stand themselves, and that often gets themselves killed. So dropping a shower keeps you safe as well from the bruisers, and then you can go for a really easy scream. Dropping a shower in general before you go for Void Gauntlet combos is something I would highly encourage because it allows you to prevent the damage that would normally come in from a melee and allows you to just get more value overall. So if you have a Void Gauntlet, my number one thing I'm looking to do is shower, and then after that I am looking to either drop Obliv if I'm a little bit late to where my bruiser's going and I see people are like kind of CC'd. So if I see the grav come out and I'm a little bit close, but I could still do a bliv into a scream, I'll try to do that. Otherwise, if you don't have time, that's when you want to go for a scream. And then you kind of cycle through all your Void Gauntlet cooldowns at that point. You try to get the orb off at the end to get the max CDR. And then at that point, you try to get out, usually with Tomb, and then you just kind of leave. So that's what you're looking for from a Void Gauntlet perspective of how to get impact on clumps. From a Bruiser perspective, I think it's pretty simple. You just kind of want to go for the biggest clump you can. But the tricky part is if you were to say be in a situation where as a Bruiser you have the option between going for like say it's like 5 Bruisers, or you can go for like 3 Blunderbuss, or maybe like a combination of Blunderbuss and healers. Like you always go for this kind of group on the right versus the group on the left, because this group on the right can't do damage to you if you're like directly in their face because they have ranged weapons and they'll all tend to want to run away. Especially with Blunderbuss cheating right now and they're trying to drop their con as low as possible, so that they are very easily punished. So I think the big thing from a bruiser perspective is you don't want to take the fight to their bruisers, but you want to take the fight to their healers and their blunderbuss, and then force their bruisers to have to peel, and then their bruisers end up fighting on top of their healers and blunderbuss, which in turn, if you go about it that way, you're going to make a clump that looks like uh, that clump at the beginning. I said this does not normally happen, where you have Great Axe Bruisers, Healers, and Void Gauntlets all in one area. And the way that this starts is by the Bruiser going for the Blunderbuss, the Void Gauntlets, and the Healers, and then the Great Axe have to turn and peel for that because otherwise those people die. So that's like the kind of chicken situation that tends to form those big clumps that tend to end up with a lot of kills that turn into point wins very easily. So that's like my biggest tip as a bruiser. Don't necessarily take the fight with the bruiser because you're just even matched. Try to take a fight that you're favored to win. And you're favored to win against Blunderbuss, Void Gauntlets, and Healers. Uh, Decks you can do at times, but very, very rarely. I would not want to go for Decks as a main prio. So yeah, just tend to look for those other people first. From a Void Gauntlet perspective, I'm looking to play near my Bruiser because my Bruiser is the person that does most of the damage, so you have to be able to support them as much as possible. So they'll throw the Grav, you look for your Scream, or you look for your Vines, or you look for both, or you look for your Ice Shower, and you just try to get value off of that, but you in general have to play very close to the vicinity of your Bruiser and in sync with your Bruiser. I think there's some exceptions to this, like if you're a Deady Point player, as a Void Gauntlet, you can break that rule and you can just kind of go for the biggest clump that you see. And the reason why that is because those big clumps will tend to get hit by the bruisers, but it's kind of the condition of like what is a big clump that you want to go for a bruiser. If it's like 5 bruisers, as a bruiser, I don't really want to go for that clump all the time because if I throw a grav into a 5 bruiser clump, then they're just gonna they're just gonna shockwave. Like one of these bruisers is just gonna shockwave me, and at that point, then I am in a spot where I'm just going to get killed by these 4 guys very, very quickly. So the only time you want to go for that sort of play is if you have a stone form up, but typically that would be a bad thing to do. Okay, from a blunderbuss perspective, how does this fit? If you go back to like the simple model that I talked about, where there's typically like rings of like layers around of where people fight, as a blunderbuss, you don't actually want to put your damage onto the bruisers themselves. You actually want to play kind of near the point and then put your damage outwards towards the enemy healers and decks, in my opinion, if they are close enough to be in your range. So this way you're kind of a space control element. It's a similar situation with Greatsword, where Greatsword fills this blunderbuss gap where you're trying to duel the people around this zone and prevent them from being close. And then if there are no people there, that's when the blunderbuss tries to deal with the void gauntlets. And then you try to deal with the bruisers, but the bruisers are again like kind of the last priority. Uh, as a blunderbuss, you're mostly looking to capitalize rather than initiate, unless you are a 50 to 100 con blunderbuss, in which case at times you can initiate, but you often won't have enough burst to finish, which is why I say you look to kind of make your impact on top of other people's impacts. So if you see this Void Gauntlet gets to 50% HP, then I'm going to go for the Void Gauntlet over going for the Dex or the Healer. If I see this Bruiser gets to 50% HP, I'm probably going to try to prio them. But the main thing is for your CC abilities, like your big ones, you want those to go towards the clump. So if I have an ice shower, I want to put that towards the clump. If I have a plague splitting grenade, I want to put that generally towards the clump. But there are times where you could drop a plague splitting grenade on a group of healers. It's like kind of that bruiser situation of like where is the clump. You want to dump it where people are tending to go to, and it's like a void gauntlet, except you don't necessarily have to follow. Sometimes you can lead, but you want to be fighting in a spot where there are bruisers that could follow up on your play very, very quickly, or other people like Dex. So you're basically trying to be opportunistic with a blunderbuss, and that's where the Dex is also comes into play. Dex players are trying to be opportunistic. Dex players are typically leads. They'll lead the damage, and other people will fall on top of them because it's so significant. So yeah. So in terms of like who's a lead, you got your bruisers who are like kind of the primary lead, and then I'd say after that you have Dex, and then after that you have Blunderbuss, and then there's not really much of a choice after that. Your Void Gauntlet's basically always playing to set up other people's plays, which is why Void Gauntlet I list on my tier guides as a support because you're trying to support what other people are doing versus a BB player I would typically view as either a tank, which is like a very, very a survivable support with basically no damage, and that's the build that I typically play on center point, or you can play it as more of a kill squad build where you're looking to play like that kind of dex role where you're kind of in between, or you could play something in a hybrid range, which is a little bit of both. But if you're playing a hybrid range, at that point you're playing opportunistic because the damage isn't actually significant enough to get enough value on that. So the biggest tip I would have overall is from a simple perspective of like you have your areas of point where one side is red, one side is blue, is if you have your key abilities, try to throw your key abilities into the red area and not the blue area. You want to try to take space, not try to hold the space that you have with your abilities. And then you want to put your normal damage on people inside of your inside of your space. The reason why is because if there are less people that are in your space and you put your normal damage there, that will force them out of your space and allow you to use your abilities on key people are in space that you want to take, and you don't actually need that like burst typically to force people out. There are some exceptions to this, like as a blunderbuss player, I think you always go for your shot into Azoth, into shot, into net on people that are in your space if there's an opportunity to go for it because it's enough burst to force them out completely. But generally, people should not be dumping their abilities on top of players that are in their controlled space and should instead just do their normal pressure. Let that pressure force their stam, and once there's people's stams is forced, that's when you look to go for these kind of plays. Basically, if you don't have a reason to use an ability, don't use it, just hold it. And that's where you get into a spot like EU where people are playing super spread all the time. And the reason why people are playing that spread is just so that kind of clump collapse doesn't really exist as much, and you're able to play more for that opportunistic method with great swords and with blunderbuss, and even with certain great axe players are able to take advantage of that. And that's why on EU too, you see kind of point is like an entirely separate fight than outside of point, because the people on point are trying to focus people in this area and they're trying to control this space. Everyone on the outside is trying to control their outside space as best they can. So that's where you kind of get into a weird spot where it's like space control, where does a great axe play, where does a blunderbuss play, where does a bruiser play, where does a healer play. But I don't want to go into like super advanced positioning in this one. I want to mostly talk about like the clump aspect. So the biggest tip for clumps is fight on top of the squishy people, not on top of the super heavy people. If you fight on top of a healer as a bruiser and they have to use sacred on themselves, that's fine. Just turn and focus the next healer. Like don't waste your time on that guy unless you have enough damage to actually kill them. But that actual neutral pressure itself does a lot more than you would think. And in general, if you're able to take fights on top of the enemy where their sacreds are not at, that's where you'll tend to get the most value in these wars. So yeah, let me know what you guys think of this. I know it was a little bit higher level, a little bit different than usual, but uh, this is like how I would best describe how to fight in terms of clumps. You always just want to look for that spot where people don't want you to fight on. Bruisers want you to fight on them, so don't fight on their bruisers. Don't give them what they want. And yeah, depending on your role, if you're a support, you're gonna play as a support, right? You're gonna wait for people to go in and then try to support their damage. Or you see a guy that's really low, that's right next to your blunderbuss. Maybe you want to scream him, lock him down, so your blunderbuss is able to get that kill. I want to force them into predictable situations that other people could take advantage of, but you have to make sure that those people that you force in those predictable situations are in a spot to be taken advantage of by your blunderbuss, by your decks, by your bruisers. So it's not as simple as just throwing your plague out everywhere. On point, that rule kind of breaks, and everyone just throws out their abilities come out everywhere at the same time. From a support perspective, because supports on point tend to be ones that are trying to spread plague as much as possible to cause people to be in more situations where they can be killed, even through sacreds, but that's like kind of an exception to this rule. Usually, as a normal player, you are trying to fight on top of spots where sacreds are not at, and you're trying to force healers to use sacreds on themselves. So, yeah, just try to be opportunistic, I think, is the biggest takeaway. Even as a bruiser, at times you could be opportunistic, but generally, bruisers are leads, decks are leads, and blunderbuss are kind of a bit of a hybrid role, and then void gauntlets are a pure support sort of role. And then a heavy blunderbuss is also a pure support sort of role. So yeah, that's what I have for this one. Let me know if you guys have any questions about this. I think it's kind of differs depending on your meta, but just try to analyze depending on your server. I'd say if you're in a spot where you have one big circle that everyone's dumping their point in. Like if you could pause a war and you see 15 people in like a really dense spot, you're usually not kind of meta, and not kind of meta. Uh, Bruisers should be trying to avoid taking those fights in that one spot as much as possible, unless they have stone form. Again, is a big consideration. If you have an ult, taking a fight on that super dense spot tends to be impactful, but if you don't have an ult, then it doesn't really make sense. It's because those ults can kill people in that one center spot, but if without those ults, that doesn't really happen. Which is why people tend to focus people that are not as split up and try to force those big clumps to move to people that don't want the clumps to be on them. So yeah, that's my big spiel for this one, and I'll see you guys in the next video.